Newport, Rhode Island, 1961. While America raced toward the space age, one mansion remained frozen in time. Every morning at the Elms, 40 servants woke before dawn to begin their work. Butlers polished silver, maids scrubbed floors by hand, laundresses washed linens without machines, hanging them to dry as they had for decades. In the basement, coal furnaces roared. On the third floor, staff dressed in quarters unchanged since 1900. And in her bedroom, 96-year-old Julia Berwind pressed buttons on an antique call box to summon whoever she needed. This wasn't a museum. It was a functioning household, the last in America still operating exactly as Gilded Age estates had 70 years earlier. The chateau itself was spectacular. 48 rooms modeled after an 18th century French palace, gardens with marble pavilions and fountains, Venetian paintings, Renaissance ceramics, Oriental jades. One of the first homes in the nation wired completely for electricity. Technology married to European elegance, creating something that announced its owner belonged among America's elite. That owner had been Julia's brother, Edward Julius Berwind, the son of a German piano maker who became a coal baron, partnering with J.P. Morgan to control over 100,000 acres of mines. His fortune bought entry to Newport society, where industrial wealth built palaces to rival European nobility. But the Berwinds had no children. When Edward died in 1936, his sister inherited everything: mansion, servants, systems, traditions. Most people would have modernized, sold off excess, reduced staff to something manageable. Julia refused. For 25 years, she maintained every outdated practice: hand laundry in the 1950s, liveried footmen in the age of television, a household that should have vanished with the Depression running at full capacity while America moved into suburbs with dishwashers. When she finally died in May 1961, developers immediately bought the property. Their plan: demolish the chateau, build a shopping center. Within months, the contents were auctioned. Paintings went to museums. Furniture scattered. The wrecking ball was scheduled for early 1962. America was about to lose something irreplaceable. Not just a mansion, but a complete, authentic, Gilded Age household that had somehow survived into the modern era. This is how it was built, how it was preserved, and how it came within 3 weeks of destruction. Chapter 1: The German Immigrant's Son. The Berwind family came from Bavaria. Johann Paulus Berwind emigrated to Philadelphia and found work at the Pretien and Berwind Piano Company, crafting instruments for customers who could afford luxuries he never enjoyed. His wife Augusta raised 5 sons in a household that ran on German discipline and immigrant ambition. Background mattered less in America than what you accomplished. That lesson shaped all the boys, but especially the third son, born June 17, 1848. They named him Edward Julius. At 17, everything changed. President Abraham Lincoln personally signed papers appointing the piano maker's son to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. How this happened isn't entirely clear from surviving records. Someone with influence recognized potential. Perhaps a Philadelphia politician, perhaps a military connection. Lincoln's signature opened doors that normally stayed closed to families like the Berwinds. Annapolis demanded discipline Edward already possessed: 4 years of rigorous training in mathematics, engineering, naval tactics, and seamanship. Graduating in June 1869 as a midshipman, he entered a military that valued competence and connections equally. Promotion to ensign came in 1870. Master, equivalent to lieutenant junior grade, followed in 1872. Service during the Franco-Prussian War gave him international experience. Meeting the Prince of Wales as an ensign provided something more valuable: a connection to European royalty that would prove useful decades later. During the Grant administration, assignment as a naval aide at the White House brought proximity to men who ran the country. But military pay was modest. Advancement slow. In May 1875, at age 26, placement on the Navy's retired list ended active service. Records cite a service-induced disability, without specifying details. The pension, roughly $150 monthly, would continue for life, but the career was over. Back in Philadelphia, his older brother Charles had already found a different path to success. Starting as an office boy at age 16 at the Powelton Coal and Iron Company, Charles had risen through sheer competence to vice president by 21. In 1869, he'd left to start his own operation. 5 years later, partnership with Judge Allison White created a firm that bore both their names. Coal was transforming America. Railroads consumed it by the ton. Factories required constant supply. Steamships needed it for Atlantic crossings. The industry was expanding rapidly, and men who controlled production controlled enormous wealth. Charles understood this. When he needed help managing growth, his younger brother, fresh from the Navy with organizational skills and leadership experience, was the obvious choice. Learning the business took years, not the physical labor of mining, but the strategic side, securing land with good deposits, negotiating contracts, understanding which customers paid reliably and which didn't, building relationships with railroad executives who bought in volume, undercutting competitors when necessary. The work required intelligence, ruthlessness, and patience. In January 1886, formal incorporation created Berwyn-White Coal Mining Company. Charles held the presidency. Judge White provided legal expertise and political connections. The younger Berwyn brother, after a decade mastering every aspect of the business, became a full partner. Then, in 1890, Charles died suddenly at 44. The question of succession was immediate. Who could step into leadership of an operation that now controlled multiple mines across Pennsylvania? Who understood both the operational details and the strategic vision? At 41, the former naval officer took control. Under his leadership, Berwyn-White would expand from a successful regional operation into something far larger, an empire built on coal that would eventually control over 100,000 acres and make its owner one of the most powerful industrialists in America. But building that empire would require more than business acumen. It would require partnership with the most powerful financier in the nation, willingness to crush labor opposition, and the kind of wealth that bought entry into circles where piano makers' sons didn't normally belong. The transformation from immigrant family to American aristocracy was about to accelerate, and it would begin with a partnership between a coal baron and a banker named J.P. Morgan. Chapter 2. The Coal Baron and J.P. Morgan. Pennsylvania sat on billions of tons of bituminous coal, and by 1890, Berwyn-White controlled an expanding network of mines extracting it. The business model was straightforward: secure land with proven deposits, open operations, lock in long-term contracts with railroads and factories that consumed fuel by the trainload. Success required three things: scale, efficiency, and access to capital for aggressive expansion. John Pierpont Morgan provided the third element. The most powerful financier in America didn't invest in small operations or sentimental partnerships. Morgan orchestrated consolidations that turned fragmented industries into efficient monopolies. He'd done it with railroads and steel. Coal was next. The arrangement with Berwyn developed through the 1890s based on mutual advantage. Morgan's capital funded rapid expansion, while Berwyn delivered the operational competence and reliable returns Morgan demanded. Results came quickly. By 1903, Berwyn-White controlled 105,000 acres of coal-bearing land across Pennsylvania, producing 2.5 million tons annually, with profits reaching $8 million. The town of Windber, Berwyn spelled backward, rose in Somerset County to house thousands of miners and their families in company-owned housing. 13 new mines opened in that county alone during 1897. But the human cost was steep. During the 1922 coal strike, Berwyn-White cut wages up to 54% and gave striking workers 5 days to vacate company housing. Families moved into tent settlements while replacement workers were hired. The company refused to recognize unions, and its mines remained open shops long after competitors had accepted collective bargaining. This earned the label "Robber Baron," a reputation Berwyn seemed to wear without discomfort. Morgan's backing opened doors beyond coal. Directorships at approximately 50 companies followed: railway companies, banks, steamship lines. Involvement in the New York subway system alongside Peter A.B. Widener. Seats on boards that controlled critical American infrastructure. By 1900, journalists counted Berwind among the 58 men who rule America. His coal supplied the United States Navy under contracts many considered monopolistic. When Berwind died in 1936, the estate was valued at $34 million. This was the fortune that would build the Elms, money extracted from Pennsylvania mountains by men breathing coal dust in darkness. But in Newport, where industrial fortunes gathered each summer to display their success, uncomfortable questions about wealth sources never arose. What mattered was demonstrating taste, culture, and the refinement to use money appropriately. Berwind had the fortune. He needed someone to teach him everything else. That education would come from a woman he met in Italy, the daughter of an American diplomat who shared his ambition to join the highest circles of society. Chapter 3. Sarah and the Art of European Elegance. Sarah Vesta. Hermione Torre grew up in Livorno, Italy, where her father Franklin served as American consular agent in the Tuscan port. She absorbed European aesthetics, understood the difference between authentic Renaissance ceramics and later imitations, could identify French Rococo paintings by technique and subject matter, knew which Venetian dealers were trustworthy. When she married the coal baron in 1886, she brought something his fortune couldn't buy: educated taste. Berwind was 38, recently successful in Pennsylvania mines, ambitious to rise beyond his origins as a piano maker's son. Sarah was 30, fluent in the visual language of European aristocracy. The partnership worked because each provided what the other lacked. Through the 1890s, they built a collection that would eventually fill a mansion. An early purchase was a series of 18th-century Venetian paintings from the Ca Corner estate in Venice, historical scenes by artists who'd worked for the Venetian Republic. These weren't decorative pieces bought for color coordination. They were paintings with documented provenance from an actual Italian palazzo, the kind of acquisition that announced serious collecting rather than mere shopping. French paintings followed. Rococo works with the refinement Sarah admired, and Berwind's fortune could secure. Renaissance ceramics from Italian estates where aristocratic families were liquidating centuries of accumulated treasures. Oriental jades that demonstrated global sophistication. Each piece carefully authenticated, each adding to what they were building together. Not just a collection, but evidence they belonged among families whose wealth was older, even if not larger. They'd been summering in Newport since 1888, renting a property on Bellevue Avenue that previous owners had called the Elms. The Italianate cottage served adequately for a few seasons. But by the late 1890s, Berwind's expanding fortune and social ambitions made the limitations obvious. The Vanderbilts had just completed the Breakers, 70 rooms of Italian Renaissance grandeur. The Astors, the Belmonts, the Golets were all building or expanding. Each mansion was a statement about hierarchy and belonging. The cottage Berwind owned couldn't make that statement. Too small for the scale of entertaining expected from a man of his wealth. Too ordinary in its architecture. In 1899, demolition crews tore it down. Sarah's vision for its replacement was specific: a French chateau in the style of Louis XVI. Not because French architecture was fashionable, though it was, but because it carried associations with centuries of aristocratic culture. A limestone facade modeled after 18th-century French neoclassicism would announce that the owners understood European sophistication, not just American commercial success. Berwind agreed immediately and hired Horace Trumbauer, a Philadelphia architect whose reputation was growing. Trumbauer had designed several impressive houses, but hadn't yet achieved the prominence he'd later gain. The commission to build a French palace for one of America's wealthiest coal barons would establish him as an architect for the industrial elite. For the interiors, they brought in Jules Allard and Sons from Paris, the firm that furnished French chateaux for actual French aristocrats. Construction would take 2 years. Sarah would live to see it completed in 1901 and enjoy summers there for 2 decades. She would host parties in the ballroom, display their Venetian paintings in the dining room, walk through gardens that took another decade to mature. But she would never see the collection reach its full potential, or witness how the house they built together would eventually become something neither of them imagined. A complete, preserved Gilded Age household that would survive into an era when such places had vanished everywhere else. That preservation would happen because of someone neither Edward nor Sarah thought much about in these years. Edward's younger sister Julia, who was quietly watching how a great house should be run. Chapter 4. Newport and the Need to Impress. Newport had transformed from sleepy colonial seaport into America's most exclusive summer colony by the 1890s. Bellevue Avenue showcased what happened when industrial fortunes competed for social position through architecture. The Vanderbilt's breakers sprawled across 70 rooms designed by Richard Morris Hunt. Its construction cost rivaled the national budget of small countries. This wasn't a vacation house. It was a statement that its owners had arrived at the pinnacle of American wealth. The families building these palaces shared a problem. Their money was new. Vanderbilt wealth came from railroads, Astor fortune from real estate and fur trading, Berwyn's from coal mines. None of them descended from aristocracy. Newport was where industrial barons transformed recent fortunes into something resembling hereditary status, but the transformation required more than simply having money. It required displaying it correctly. Mrs. Caroline Astor controlled who mattered. Her 400, the number fitting in her ballroom, represented the families worth knowing. Her approval determined invitations to important parties. Her judgment about taste influenced every architectural decision on Bellevue Avenue. Even families with unlimited funds sought her endorsement before building. Cross her standards and you were dismissed as vulgar new money regardless of your bank account. Berwyn understood this perfectly. His coal operations generated millions in annual profits. He counted Theodore Roosevelt and Kaiser Wilhelm II among his correspondents. But the cottage he'd been using since 1888 undermined those achievements. The building was modest, unimpressive, the kind of summer house a successful businessman might own, but not someone claiming a place among the elite. When guests arrived, they saw immediately that the owner hadn't quite reached the top tier. By 1898, continuing in that cottage had become impossible. The Vanderbilts were importing entire rooms from European palaces. Stanford White was designing mansions that set new standards for Newport grandeur. Every season brought architectural triumphs that raised expectations. Sarah pushed for action. She'd been patient, but patience had limits when every party invitation reminded her that their house didn't measure up. In 1899, demolition crews tore down the cottage completely. Whatever replaced it would be designed from the ground up to make the impression the Berwyns required. Half measures wouldn't work. The new house had to silence anyone who still questioned whether a piano maker's son belonged among America's industrial aristocracy. Choosing an architect was critical. Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the breakers, had died in 1895. Stanford White was prominent but notoriously difficult. Berwyn wanted someone talented who would give the project complete attention. Horace Trumbauer, a Philadelphia architect born in 1868, fit perfectly. He'd built impressive houses for wealthy clients, but hadn't achieved national prominence. A major commission from one of America's wealthiest coal barons would establish him among the top tier. The opportunity was mutual. Berwyn needed the right architect. Trumbauer needed the career-defining project. Sarah's specifications were precise. A French chateau in Louis XVI style. Not Baroque grandeur or Rococo excess, but the refined neoclassical elegance that characterized French architecture in the 1750s and 60s. Trumbauer would model the design on Chateau d'Asnières, built near Paris in 1750. The interior would be handled by Jules Allard and Sons from Paris, the firm that furnished actual French aristocrats. The budget would exceed $1 million, possibly approach $1.5 million depending on finishes and furnishings. That was acceptable. Trumbauer promised completion within 2 years if construction proceeded aggressively. Ground would be broken immediately. By summer 1901, the Berwyns would host their opening party in a house designed to prove they belonged. 48 rooms filled with authenticated European art. gardens that would eventually rival anything on Bellevue Avenue, technology hidden so perfectly that the house seemed to run by magic, every detail calculated to demonstrate not just wealth, but the taste and sophistication that supposedly separated true elite from merely rich industrialists. The cottage that had embarrassed them was gone. In its place would rise something magnificent enough to silence every doubt, answer every whispered criticism, and establish the Berwynds permanently among Newport's finest families. At least that was the plan. Chapter 5. Building a French Dream in America. Construction began in spring 1899 with foundation excavation. The site required substantial preparation, leveling ground, digging deep enough to support 5 stories of limestone and steel, creating drainage systems that would protect the structure for decades. Smith and Son, contractors from Wilmington, managed the build with crews that would eventually number in the hundreds. Horace Trumbauer's design called for a structural steel frame, revolutionary for residential construction. Most houses still relied on load-bearing masonry walls, but steel allowed larger rooms, taller ceilings, and greater flexibility in interior layouts. More importantly, steel made the building fireproof. The breakers had burned completely in 1892 before the Vanderbilts rebuilt it. Berwind wanted no chance of similar catastrophe destroying his investment. The exterior walls would be Indiana limestone, quarried in the Midwest and shipped east by rail. Masons shaped each block on site to exact specifications. The stone's pale color and fine grain captured light beautifully, giving the facade the elegant appearance Trumbauer intended. Workers laid courses with precision. Joints had to be tight, surfaces perfectly smooth, proportions exactly matching the architect's drawings. Château d'Asnières, the French model, had been built in 1750 for the Marquis de Voyer. Trumbauer studied it carefully but created interpretation rather than copy. The original featured 5 bay flanking sections. Trumbauer's used 4. The balustrade at the Elms rose taller but simpler in detail. The garden façade's pediment likely came from studying Hôtel Porges in Paris rather than Asnières itself. The result was unmistakably French but adapted for American scale and 19th century construction techniques. Inside, Jules Allard and Sons from Paris took control. The firm specialized in furnishing French chateaux for actual aristocrats, which made them perfect for Americans attempting to replicate European sophistication. Allard designed every major room around the art collection the Berwynds had been building. The dining room would showcase their Venetian paintings. The drawing room would display Renaissance ceramics in custom vitrines. Nothing was left to chance or local craftsmen's interpretation. Technology distinguished the Elms from earlier Newport mansions. Berwind wanted cutting-edge systems hidden so perfectly that guests would never see the machinery making everything work. The house would run like a luxury hotel but appear to operate by magic. Electricity came first. The Elms was among the first American houses wired completely for electric lighting with no gas backup system. Over 1,500 light bulbs would illuminate the mansion, though early bulbs produced only 10 watts each, roughly equivalent to candles. That's why fixtures clustered lights together, multiple bulbs compensating for individual weakness. The electrical plant, with its generators and switchboards, occupied basement space where visitors would never encounter it. Refrigeration followed. One of the first electric ice makers in residential use went into the kitchen, eliminating dependence on ice deliveries. The machine was massive, noisy, and required constant monitoring, but it meant the Berwynds could serve perfectly chilled champagne whenever they chose, without worrying about ice supply. The heating system utilized 3 coal-fired boilers in the basement, distributing warmth through radiators in every major room. But coal presented a problem. How to deliver tons of fuel without guests seeing dirty wagons or workers hauling it through the property? Trumbauer's solution was ingenious, an underground tunnel extending from Dixon Street to the basement. Coal arrived on small railroad cars running on tracks through the passage, traveling from street to boiler room without ever appearing above ground. Ash removal used the same system in reverse. Communication throughout the house employed a call box system installed in nearly every room. Pressing a button sent signals to annunciator panels in servant areas, allowing family members to summon specific staff without shouting or searching. The technology was cutting edge for 1900. Similar systems existed in hotels and office buildings, but residential installation remained rare. For servants, it meant instant response to summons from any location in the mansion. The design segregated servant spaces completely from family areas. Back staircases, hidden passages, service corridors, all carefully positioned so staff could move through the house invisibly. Servants entered through a side door covered by wisteria vines that concealed activity from windows above. The wisteria also muffled sounds of deliveries and work, maintaining the peaceful atmosphere Berwyn demanded. Construction proceeded rapidly through 1899 and 1900. Stone masons worked from scaffolding as walls rose floor by floor. Carpenters framed interior partitions using terracotta blocks covered with plaster rather than wood, another fireproofing measure. Plasterers applied multiple coats, each layer sanded smooth before the next. Windows arrived custom manufactured to fit openings exactly. The roof structure, with its steep French pitch, required specialized carpentry, but created the dramatic roofline that made the building recognizable from miles away. By late 1900, the exterior was essentially complete. The limestone facade gleamed. The roof was on, covered in dark slate tiles individually cut and placed. Windows were installed. From outside, the Elms looked finished. Inside was different. Rooms remained empty shells requiring months of additional work before Allard's furnishings could be installed. Final costs approached $1.5 million, though Berwyn never disclosed exact figures publicly. The amount was staggering for 1901, equivalent to over $50 million today. But the house delivered exactly what he'd commissioned. A French chateau that wouldn't have seemed out of place in the Loire Valley, equipped with technology that made it one of the most sophisticated residences in America. In summer 1901, Edward and Sarah Berwyn hosted their opening party. Hundreds of guests toured rooms filled with authenticated European treasures. They admired the Venetian paintings, examined the Renaissance ceramics, walked through spaces where every detail announced taste and refinement. The house had cost a fortune, but it accomplished its purpose. Nobody would question whether the Berwyns belonged among Newport's elite. The building itself answered that question permanently. Chapter 6: The Gardens and the Garage. The house completed in 1901, but the grounds remained unfinished. Berwyn had 14 acres to transform from farmland into something worthy of the chateau. The initial landscape plan, created by Ernest W. Bowditch working with Trumbauer, called for naturalistic planting with a large lily pond at the property's far edge. It was pleasant but unremarkable, not the statement Berwyn needed. By 1907, taste had shifted. The newest Newport estates were embracing formal European garden design, particularly French and Italian styles that emphasized geometry, symmetry, and classical sculpture. Rosecliffe's Gardens, completed in 1902, had set a new standard with their elaborate parterre designs and marble pavilions. The Berwyns decided their grounds needed similar treatment. Bowditch returned with Jacques Greber, a French landscape architect whose expertise in classical garden design was exactly what the project required. Together, they reimagined the entire landscape in the tradition of 18th century French palace gardens. The naturalistic approach disappeared, replaced by something far more ambitious. The centerpiece became a grand allée extending from the house toward two marble pavilions positioned along a cross-axis. The scale was enormous. Hundreds of feet of perfectly maintained lawn creating a vista that recalled Versailles or Fontainebleau. At the far end, steps descended to a sunken garden featuring elaborate plantings, additional sculpture, and water features. The sunken garden alone required years to execute properly. Greber designed intricate parterre patterns using boxwood hedges that needed time to mature into the precise geometric shapes intended. Marble benches, urns, and decorative elements arrived from European suppliers. Bronze sculptures were commissioned from established artists. Every element had to work together, creating a unified composition that looked effortless despite requiring constant maintenance. American elm trees originally lined the property, giving the Elms its name. but Dutch elm disease swept through New England before World War II, killing nearly every elm in the region. The Berwynds eventually replaced them with weeping beeches, which created a different but equally striking effect: silvery bark and cascading branches that shimmered in sunlight. Fountains appeared throughout the landscape. The sunken garden included multiple water features, their jets carefully calibrated to create pleasing patterns without overwhelming the space. Bronze dolphins and sea creatures decorated the fountain basins. The sound of water became constant background throughout the grounds, softening the formality and providing movement to otherwise static compositions. 44 urns were positioned strategically across terraces and walkways. 29 sculptures, ranging from classical figures to decorative animals, occupied key locations. 2 main entrance gates, plus a stable courtyard gate controlled access. 3 major fountains anchored different garden areas. The inventory of decorative elements alone represented substantial investment, each piece selected for its contribution to the overall design. The carriage house occupied the property's edge, housing horses, carriages, and quarters for stable hands above. But by 1910, the automobile was replacing horse-drawn transportation among wealthy families. The Berwynds owned several cars and needed proper storage with maintenance facilities. Trumbauer designed a new garage clad in limestone to match the house. The structure stretched 125 feet long by 70 feet deep, among the largest private garages in America. Inside, a central track allowed vehicles to enter, park, and exit without complicated maneuvering. 2 gasoline tanks provided fuel. The scale reflected both the number of vehicles the Berwynds owned and the space required for early automobiles, which were considerably larger than modern cars. The garage included one feature that became part of Elms lore: an automobile turntable. The Berwynds' head coachman had transitioned to chauffeur when cars replaced carriages, but he couldn't master backing vehicles out of the tight garage spaces. Rather than hire a new driver, Berwynd installed a rotating platform. Cars drove onto the turntable, which rotated them to face the exit. The chauffeur could then drive forward out of the garage, avoiding the backward maneuvering he'd never learned. This wasn't unique to the Elms. Several wealthy families installed similar devices when their longtime coachmen couldn't adapt to automobile operation. But it illustrated how even the wealthiest households navigated the transition from 19th to 20th century technology. You could build a state-of-the-art garage with gasoline tanks and maintenance facilities, but if your trusted employee couldn't back up a car, you adapted the building to accommodate his limitations. By 1914, the gardens had reached their intended mature state. The boxwood had grown into precise geometric patterns. The sculptures and urns were weathering appropriately. The fountains operated reliably. The LA's vista created exactly the impression Greber had envisioned: a French palace garden transplanted to Rhode Island, requiring 12 gardeners to maintain its perfection. The Elms was complete: house, grounds, garage, everything designed and built to announce that Edward Berwynd belonged among America's most refined families. The German immigrant's son had created something that rivaled European chateau. Now it needed to function as intended, hosting the elaborate parties and social events that define Newport's summer season. That responsibility would fall primarily to Sarah, who understood exactly how a great house should be run and what it took to impress guests who'd seen everything wealth could buy. Chapter 7: 40 Servants and How to Be Invisible. Running the Elms required 40 people working in carefully orchestrated hierarchy. 16 indoor servants handled the house itself: butler, footmen, housemaids, ladies' maids, cooks, kitchen staff. 24 outdoor workers maintained the grounds: head gardener, undergardeners, stable hands who became garage mechanics, groundskeepers who kept the 14 acres immaculate. Together, they created the illusion that a 48-room mansion operated effortlessly, as if luxury simply materialized without human labor. The summer season ran from July 4th through late August, 6 weeks when the Berwynds occupied the Elms and expected perfection. Most staff traveled with the family between their New York townhouse at 2 East 64th Street and Newport, moving several days ahead to prepare whichever residence the family would occupy next. Opening the Elms meant airing rooms closed since previous summer, stocking kitchens, ensuring every surface gleamed before the family arrived. The butler commanded indoor staff with absolute authority. He managed footmen who served meals, answered doors, and attended to male guests. Below him, the housekeeper supervised chambermaids responsible for bedrooms, hallways, and public spaces. The cook, imported from France because French cuisine was essential for entertaining, controlled the kitchen with help from multiple assistants. A pastry chef handled desserts and baked goods separately. Ladies' maids attended to Mrs. Berwin personally, managing her wardrobe and helping her dress for multiple daily costume changes that formal society demanded. Recruiting staff came primarily from England and Ireland, where domestic service training was rigorous and expectations clear. European servants understood the formality wealthy American families desired. They knew proper service techniques, appropriate behavior in front of guests, and the rigid protocols that governed great houses. The French chef represented the pinnacle of this hierarchy, culinary expertise that couldn't be found among American cooks, no matter how skilled. The third floor housed servants in 16 bedrooms sharing 3 large bathrooms. Quarters were functional rather than comfortable. Simple furniture, minimal decoration, designed for sleep and basic hygiene between long work shifts. Men and women both lived on this floor, though strict rules governed interaction between sexes. Only single servants lived in the house. Married couples typically worked as part of outdoor staff and resided in apartments above the garage or other property buildings. Invisibility was fundamental to proper service. Servants moved through the house using back staircases and hidden passages designed so family and guests never encountered staff unless specifically summoned. The main entrance for servants was on the building's side, covered by wisteria vines thick enough to block view from upper windows. The wisteria also muffled sounds of deliveries, conversations, and work activity that would disturb the peaceful atmosphere expected in wealthy homes. The call box system made summoning staff efficient without requiring anyone to shout or search. Nearly every room contained buttons connecting to annunciator panels in servant areas. Pressing a button in the library sent a signal to the panel indicating which room needed attention. A servant would check the annunciator, see library indicated, and respond immediately. The technology was essentially an early intercom system, though only one way. Family could summon servants, but servants couldn't use it to communicate upward. Meal service required elaborate choreography. Food prepared in the basement kitchen traveled to the dining room via dumbwaiter, emerging in the butler's pantry adjacent to the dining area. Footmen received dishes from the dumbwaiter, arranged them on serving platters, and brought them to the dining room where the butler orchestrated service. Every movement was timed, every dish arrived at proper temperature, every course flowed seamlessly into the next. Guests saw only the performance, never the logistics making it possible. The coal tunnel exemplified the lengths taken to maintain invisibility. Tons of coal arrived regularly during cold months to feed the 3 basement boilers heating the entire house. Rather than allow delivery wagons and coal-covered workers to appear anywhere near the main house, the system used underground railway cars traveling from Dixon Street to the basement. Coal arrived hidden, was shoveled into boilers unseen, and ash removed the same way. The process was dirty, physical work, but guests never witnessed it. Laundry occupied a separate basement area where staff washed bed linens, table linens, towels, clothing, and the specialized fabrics requiring careful handling. Early 20th century laundry meant heating water, scrubbing by hand, wringing, hanging to dry, pressing with heavy irons. A household this size generated mountains of laundry daily. The work was endless, physical, and invisible. Clean linens appeared as if by magic. For outdoor staff, work was equally demanding, but different in nature. The head gardener supervised teams maintaining 12 acres of formal gardens, where every boxwood hedge needed precise trimming. Every lawn required constant cutting. Every flower bed demanded seasonal planting. Gardeners worked year-round to maintain the perfection visible during the 6-week summer season. Fountains needed monitoring, sculptures required cleaning, Gravel paths needed raking smooth. The garage staff transitioned from caring for horses and carriages to maintaining automobiles and keeping the enormous garage spotless. Early cars required constant mechanical attention. Engines needed regular adjustment. Tires failed frequently. Systems broke down in ways that demanded immediate repair. Having dedicated mechanics on staff meant the Berwyn's vehicles remained operational without depending on outside services. This was standard for Newport's grandest estates during the Gilded Age. Every major mansion operated with similar staff numbers and expectations. The system was expensive, demanding, and utterly dependent on maintaining rigid class boundaries that kept servants in their designated places. It worked because enough people accepted that domestic service was legitimate employment, even honorable for those who performed it excellently. What nobody predicted in 1901 was that this system would vanish almost everywhere within 40 years. The Great Depression, World War II, and changing social attitudes would make 40-servant households unsustainable even for the wealthy. Newport's great houses would close, be sold, or dramatically reduce staff to bare minimums. The Elms would be different. Long after every other comparable household had modernized or disappeared, 40 servants would still climb those back staircases, still respond to call box summons, still maintain the illusion that the house ran by magic. But that wouldn't happen under Edward or Sarah Berwyn. It would happen because someone else entirely would inherit the Elms and refuse to let the past go. Chapter 8. Sarah's Death and Julia's Entrance. On January 5, 1922, Sarah Torrey Berwyn died at the Elms. She was 66 years old. The cause was listed simply as heart failure. Her heart stopped, and there was nothing the doctors attending her could do. Edward, at 73, had spent 36 years married to the woman who'd taught him to appreciate art, understand European culture, and navigate Newport society. Now he faced the question of how to continue without her. The obvious solution would have been to close the Elms or reduce its operations drastically. A widower in his 70s had no obligation to maintain a 48-room summer house requiring 40 servants. He could have sold it, donated it, or simply shuttered it permanently. Many Newport families were already making such decisions as the Gilded Age faded, and maintaining these enormous estates became increasingly impractical. Edward chose differently. He invited his youngest sister Julia to become his hostess, taking over the social responsibilities Sarah had managed for 2 decades. Julia was 57 years old, unmarried, and had been living relatively quietly in Philadelphia. The invitation meant moving to New York to manage Edward's Fifth Avenue townhouse during winter months, then relocating to Newport each summer to run the Elms throughout the season. Julia accepted immediately. She was born in 1864 or 65. Sources disagree on the exact year, the youngest of the Berwyn children and Edward's only sister. She'd watched her brothers build the coal empire from the outside, never participating in business decisions, but benefiting from the family's rising wealth. Unlike Edward, who'd attended Annapolis and built his own fortune, Julia's life had followed the path expected of wealthy unmarried women in her era, managing households, participating in social welfare activities, maintaining connections with appropriate families. Taking over as Edward's hostess elevated her status dramatically. The Elms and the New York townhouse were among the finest residences in America, filled with art worth millions, and visited by the most powerful people in the nation. Managing these properties meant controlling guest lists, planning entertainments, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards Edward demanded. It was responsibility and power Julia had never experienced before. She proved surprisingly capable. The 40 servants who'd worked for Sarah adapted to Julia's management. The same standards continued, every surface spotless, every meal perfectly orchestrated, every guest accommodation anticipated. But Julia brought her own personality to the role. She was more direct than Sarah, less interested in subtle social maneuvering, more focused on efficient household operation than cultivating particular friendships. One habit shocked Newport society. Julia drove herself. Wealthy women in the 1920s didn't typically operate their own automobiles. That's what chauffeurs were for. But Julia owned several luxury cars, including a Renault that became her signature vehicle, and she took the wheel whenever she chose. Rumors circulated that her social secretary performed a white glove test on the steering wheel before each trip, ensuring no dust contaminated Julia's hands. Whether true or embellished, the story captured something real about her character. She wanted control, but expected everything around her to maintain perfect condition. Edward and Julia settled into a comfortable partnership over the next 14 years. He continued managing his business interests from New York, though by his 70s he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations of Berwyn White. She ran both households with the efficiency she'd demonstrated from the start. They weren't particularly close emotionally. This was a practical arrangement more than a warm sibling relationship, but it functioned well. The summer routine remained unchanged from Sarah's era. 6 weeks at the Elms beginning July 4th. Elaborate parties drawing Newport's elite, dinners where place settings and menu selections received as much attention as guest lists. Everything calibrated to maintain the Berwyns' position among families who mattered socially. On August 18, 1936, Edward Julius Berwyn died at his New York townhouse. He was 88 years old and had been in declining health for several months. The funeral service at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue drew hundreds of mourners, business associates, social connections, politicians, and distant family members. His body was taken to West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, where he was interred in a mausoleum modeled after the Tower of the Winds in Athens. Horace Trumbauer, who designed the Elms 36 years earlier, had designed the tomb as well. The estate was valued at $34 million. His will divided the fortune among family members and charitable causes, but the Elms itself went entirely to Julia. She inherited the house, the furnishings, the art collection, the land, everything. At 71 years old, she became sole owner of one of Newport's grandest estates. She faced an immediate choice. The mansion was expensive to maintain. The 40 servants represented enormous annual payroll. The Depression had squeezed even wealthy families, forcing many to reduce staff or sell properties they could no longer afford. Julia was independently wealthy from Edward's bequests, but maintaining the Elms at full operation would consume resources rapidly. Most people expected her to scale back, reduce to 10 or 15 servants, close parts of the house, limit summer seasons to a few weeks instead of 6. That would have been practical, rational, and completely understandable given her age and the economic climate. Julia refused every suggestion along those lines. The Elms would continue exactly as it had under Edward and Sarah. 40 servants, full 6-week summers, every tradition maintained precisely. She wasn't interested in practical or rational. She was interested in preserving what Edward and Sarah had built, operating it exactly as they had intended. What nobody understood in 1936 was that Julia would maintain this stance for 25 years. While America moved through World War II, the post-war boom, television, suburbs, and dishwashers, the Elms would remain frozen in 1900. Julia would keep the Gilded Age alive through sheer stubborn determination long after it had vanished everywhere else. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Kept 1901 Alive Until 1961. With Edward gone, Julia inherited 40 servants, a 48-room chateau, and a choice. America was moving into a new era. The Depression had forced even wealthy families to cut household staff, close wings of mansions, simplify their lives. By the late 1930s, houses like the Elms were disappearing, sold to institutions, demolished for land value, or maintained at drastically reduced scale. The age of 40-servant households was ending. Julia ignored all of that. The Elms would continue operating exactly as it had since 1901. Same staff numbers, same 6-week summer season, same standards for every detail from laundry to lawn maintenance. She wasn't preserving the past out of sentiment. She simply saw no reason to change what worked perfectly well. This seemed briefly reasonable in 1936. Julia was wealthy, the house was paid for, and maintaining tradition didn't yet look anachronistic. But as years passed and the gap between the Elms and the rest of America widened, Julia's household became increasingly strange. World War II mobilized the nation. Women took factory jobs. Servants left domestic work for better-paying industrial employment. Yet the Elms continued unchanged, 40 people still climbing back staircases to serve one elderly woman. The laundry room illustrated the disconnect. By the 1940s, American homes had washing machines and dryers. Even modest middle-class families owned appliances that made laundry faster and easier. The Elms had none of it. Staff washed linens by hand, wrung them manually, hung them to dry, pressed them with heavy irons exactly as they had in 1900. Julia saw no need for washers or dryers. The old methods worked. The new machines were unnecessary. The call box system remained the primary way Julia summoned servants, though by the 1950s the technology was laughably outdated. Telephones were in every American home. Intercoms existed that allowed two-way communication, but the Elms still used one-way call buttons connecting to annunciator panels, a system designed before reliable phone service existed. Julia pressed buttons, servants checked panels, and everyone pretended this was normal household operation. Her winters at New York's Savoy Plaza Hotel followed the same pattern. She maintained a suite year-round, returning to the Elms only for summers. The hotel provided the services she required without needing to keep the New York townhouse fully staffed. But the Newport house remained operational all year. Skeleton crew during winter, full 40-person staff every summer without exception. Other Newport families were abandoning their estates entirely by the 1950s. The breakers had been donated to the Preservation Society. Marble House was empty. Rosecliff was struggling. The cost of maintaining these places exceeded what even wealthy families could justify. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, and staff payroll consumed hundreds of thousands annually for buildings used only weeks each year. Julia didn't care about the economics. The Elms would continue because that's what Edward had intended. She had the money. Both her inheritance and income from Edward's estate provided more than enough to cover expenses. The question wasn't whether she could afford it. The question was why she persisted when everyone else had acknowledged that this way of living was finished. Part of the answer was habit. Julia had run the Elms since 1922. 39 years of summers managing the same household with the same routines created patterns she found no reason to disrupt. She knew the systems, the staff knew their roles, everything functioned smoothly. Changing would require effort for no benefit she could identify. But there was also pride. The Elms represented Edward's achievement, his rise from piano maker's son to industrial baron, his acceptance among America's elite, his creation of something magnificent. Letting it decline or simplify felt like betraying his accomplishment. Maintaining it exactly as he'd built it honored what he'd achieved. That mattered more to Julia than adapting to contemporary standards. So the anachronisms accumulated. In 1958, Julia was one of only 3 Newport residents who still employed liveried footmen, servants dressed in formal uniforms to serve at dinner. The practice had been standard in 1900 but was ridiculously old-fashioned by the 1950s. Julia didn't care. Footmen in livery were proper. Modern informality was not. She did make one concession to changing times. She invited poor children from the neighborhood to the Elms for cookies and milk. The practice became regular enough that local families knew Miss Berwind would welcome kids who wanted a treat. It was generous, unusual for someone of her class, and suggested that beneath the stubborn preservation of outdated customs lived someone who understood that wealth carried some obligation toward people who had less. But that generosity didn't extend to updating how her own servants lived and worked. They continued laboring under conditions that would have been normal in 1900, but were exploitative by 1960s standards. Hand-washing laundry, climbing countless stairs daily, working long hours for wages that hadn't increased proportionally with the rest of the economy. The servants stayed because jobs were jobs, but the Elms was becoming increasingly difficult to staff as younger workers rejected domestic service entirely. Julia was 96 years old in 1961, still summering at the Elms, still maintaining the full complement of 40 servants, still insisting on standards that belonged to a vanished era. She'd outlived everyone who'd known Edward. She'd outlived the Gilded Age by half a century. She was living proof that with enough money and enough stubbornness, you could keep the past alive indefinitely. On May 16, 1961, Julia Berwind died at the Elms. With her death, the last authentic Gilded Age household in America ceased to exist. 40 servants who'd worked under 19th century conditions suddenly faced an uncertain future. The house that had operated continuously since 1901 with no concessions to modernity finally reached its end. What happened next would determine whether the Elms survived at all. Julia's nephew would inherit, and he would have none of her attachment to preserving the past. Within months, everything Julia had protected for 25 years would be threatened with complete destruction. Chapter 10. Julia dies and the wrecking ball looms. Charles E. Dunlap inherited the Elms in May 1961. He was 73 years old, Julia's nephew through her sister, and he had no interest whatsoever in a 48-room mansion requiring 40 servants. He'd built his own life, his own career, and had no romantic attachment to his aunt's determination to preserve the past. The Elms was a financial burden he wanted eliminated immediately. The practical problems were obvious. Annual operating costs ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property taxes alone consumed substantial sums. Insurance on a building filled with valuable art and antiques was expensive. Utilities for heating, electricity, and water added more. The 40-person payroll was the largest expense. Even if Dunlap wanted to maintain the Elms at reduced capacity, he'd need at least 10 to 15 staff, and that still meant significant annual costs for a house he'd use perhaps a few weeks each year. He had no intention of trying. Within weeks of inheriting, Dunlap contacted real estate developers in New York. The proposition was straightforward. 14 acres on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, complete with a large building that could be demolished. The location was prime. The land value was substantial. Someone would want it. Multiple developers expressed interest. The winning group had a clear vision: tear down the mansion, subdivide the property, and build a shopping center. Newport needed retail space. The location was perfect for commercial development. The chateau was irrelevant, a relic from an era nobody cared about anymore, built for a lifestyle that had vanished. Demolition would be quick. Construction could begin almost immediately. Dunlap accepted their offer. The sale closed in summer 1961. The developers now owned the Elms and had every legal right to do with it as they pleased. Their plans didn't include preservation. Before demolition could proceed, the contents needed liquidation. In late 1961, a public auction was announced. Everything inside the Elms would be sold: furniture, paintings, sculptures, ceramics, tapestries, decorative objects accumulated over 60 years. The Venetian paintings Edward and Sarah had purchased from the Sia Corner estate, the Renaissance ceramics, the French furniture by Jules Allard, the Oriental jades, all of it would be dispersed to whoever bid highest. The auction drew crowds. Dealers came from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, looking for valuable pieces they could resell. Collectors sought specific items for their own homes. Museums sent representatives to bid on significant works. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York acquired several of the most valuable paintings, works that would have remained in private hands if the Elms had continued operating as Julia intended. Furniture sold for reasonable prices, but not extraordinary ones. The market for elaborate Gilded Age furnishings was soft in 1961. Young families buying suburban homes wanted modern furniture, not heavy carved pieces requiring rooms with 12-foot ceilings. Dealers bought speculatively, hoping taste would shift eventually, but weren't paying premium prices. The auction lasted several days. Room by room, the Elms was stripped. The dining room lost its Venetian paintings. The drawing room's vitrines emptied of ceramics. Bedrooms were cleared of furniture. The conservatory's decorative elements disappeared. By the time auctioneers finished, the house was essentially bare. Walls, floors, architectural details remained, but everything movable was gone. The emptiness was shocking. The Elms had been a complete environment, every object carefully chosen to create specific impressions. Now it was just rooms. Beautiful rooms with fine proportions and excellent craftsmanship, but empty shells that revealed how much the furnishings had contributed to the overall effect. Neighbors watched the auction with resignation. The Elms was just the latest casualty in Newport's ongoing crisis. Villa Rosa, the mansion next door, had already been demolished for subdivisions. Arley had burned in 1932 and never been rebuilt. Stoneacre was under demolition. Half a dozen other estates had been given to churches or schools, their original purposes abandoned. The idea that Bellevue Avenue's architectural heritage deserved protection hadn't yet gained traction. These were just old houses that cost too much to maintain. The Preservation Society of Newport County watched with growing alarm. The organization had been founded in 1945 to protect Newport's colonial-era buildings, 18th-century houses with historical significance. They'd expanded into preserving a few Gilded Age mansions, acquiring the breakers from the Vanderbilt family in 1948. But their resources were limited. They couldn't save everything. Choices had to be made about which buildings mattered most. The Elms presented a difficult case. It wasn't the largest Newport mansion, the breakers in Ochre Court were bigger. It wasn't architecturally unique. Other houses by Horace Trumbauer existed. Its owners hadn't been as prominent as the Vanderbilts or Astors. Why should the Elms be saved when so many other worthy buildings were being lost? The answer, though nobody fully understood it yet, was that the Elms was different in one crucial way. Julia's stubborn refusal to modernize meant the house was a time capsule. Most Gilded Age mansions that survived had been updated. Wiring replaced, systems modernized, servants' quarters converted to other uses. The Elms remained untouched. Everything was original, from the call box system to the coal tunnel to the servants' bedrooms on the third floor. It was the most complete, authentic example of how these houses had actually functioned. But recognizing that significance required time the Preservation Society didn't have. The developers had scheduled demolition for early 1962. The wrecking ball was coming. The Elms had weeks left, maybe a month or two at most, before becoming rubble in memory. Chapter 11. 3 weeks from destruction. The Preservation Society of Newport County had weeks to raise money, negotiate purchase, and complete the transaction before demolition equipment arrived. Their budget was already stretched from maintaining the breakers and several colonial properties. Acquiring another massive estate, particularly one stripped of its furnishings, seemed financially impossible. But letting the Elms be destroyed would mean losing something they were only beginning to understand was irreplaceable. The campaign began with phone calls. Board members contacted wealthy Newport families, explained the urgency, asked for pledges. Some responded generously. The loss of Villa Rosa next door was fresh in everyone's memory, and the idea of another Bellevue Avenue mansion becoming a parking lot troubled people who'd watched the neighborhood's character erode. Others were skeptical. Why save a house that couldn't sustain itself economically? Wasn't this just throwing money at a problem that would recur endlessly? The Preservation Society needed $116,000. That was the price developers had paid, and that's what they'd accept to sell rather than demolish. It wasn't an enormous sum compared to what these mansions had cost to build, but it was substantial for an organization operating on limited annual budgets. Every dollar raised would commit them to decades of future maintenance expenses. Timing worked in their favor unexpectedly. The stock market was declining through late 1961 and early 1962. Not a crash, but enough instability that developers with leveraged positions were feeling pressure. Their shopping center plan depended on financing that was becoming harder to secure as lenders grew cautious. The Elms was tying up capital they couldn't easily deploy elsewhere. Negotiations proceeded quickly. The developers wanted out. The Preservation Society wanted in. The question was whether enough donors could be convinced quickly enough. Pledges came in gradually. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. occasionally a larger commitment from someone who understood what was at stake. The total crept upward through January and into February. On a morning in late February 1962, the Preservation Society closed on the purchase. $116,000 secured the Elms, its 14 acres, the carriage house, and several outbuildings. The developers walked away, abandoning their shopping center plans. The wrecking ball never arrived. The house was saved, but it was nearly empty. The auction had dispersed most furnishings, though some large pieces built into the architecture remained. The massive dining room fireplace, mirrors too large to remove easily, some architectural elements that were essentially part of the building. The Preservation Society immediately began contacting auction buyers, trying to reacquire pieces that had belonged at the Elms. Some dealers were willing to sell back what they'd purchased, particularly when they understood the items would return to their original location. Other pieces were gone permanently, sold to private collectors who wouldn't part with them. Museums offered help. Loans of period-appropriate furniture filled gaps where original pieces couldn't be recovered. Gifts from other estates provided additional furnishings, not original to the Elms, but authentic to the era and appropriate to the rooms. Slowly, the house began looking furnished again rather than stripped. The decision was made to open the Elms to the public as soon as possible. Not in months or years, but weeks. The Preservation Society needed to demonstrate that the house could generate revenue through admissions, justify the purchase to skeptical donors, and create momentum for continued fundraising. In early March 1962, just 3 weeks after the scheduled demolition date, the Elms opened for tours. The response exceeded expectations. Visitors were fascinated by the mansion's scale and elegance, but also by something unexpected: the servants' areas. Most house museums showed only the grand public rooms where wealthy families entertained. The Elms could show both sides, the formal spaces visitors expected, plus the back staircases, servants' quarters, kitchen, laundry, coal tunnel, and call box system that revealed how the house had actually functioned. The Preservation Society developed what became known as the Servant Life Tour, the only tour of its kind in Newport. Guests could walk through the third-floor bedrooms where 16 indoor servants had lived, see the annunciator panels that received call box signals, stand in the laundry room where staff had washed linens by hand into the 1950s, descend into the basement to see the coal tunnel railway and the massive boilers, experience both sides of Gilded Age life, the luxury and the labor that created it. This was the Elms' unique value. Julia's refusal to modernize, which had seemed merely eccentric during her lifetime, had preserved something extraordinary. Other mansions had updated their infrastructure, converted servants' quarters to storage, removed outdated systems. The Elms remained frozen at 1901, offering future generations the most complete picture of how these households had operated. The call box system Julia used until 1961 was the same technology installed 60 years earlier. The laundry methods unchanged, the coal delivery system still functional. Within months, the Elms became one of Newport's most popular attractions. Visitors who'd seen the Breakers or Marble House found something different here. Not just architectural grandeur, but genuine insight into the mechanisms of Gilded Age life. School groups came to learn about domestic service and class structure. Historians appreciated the authenticity. General tourists enjoyed seeing both upstairs and downstairs in a way no other Newport mansion offered. The house that had nearly become a shopping center was now educating thousands of people annually about an era that had vanished everywhere else. Julia's stubbornness, which had seemed pointless when she was alive, had inadvertently created the most authentic Gilded Age museum in America. By refusing to acknowledge that times had changed, she'd preserved evidence of how things had been. In 1971, the Elms was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. 25 years later, in 1996, it received designation as a National Historic Landmark, recognition that the property possessed exceptional national significance. The house Edward Berwind built to prove he belonged among America's elite had become something he never imagined, a public monument teaching future generations about the age that created it. The Preservation Society continues maintaining the Elms today, operating it as they have since 1962. The servants' quarters remain accessible. The call box system is demonstrated to visitors. The coal tunnel can be toured. Everything Julia preserved by refusing to modernize remains available for anyone curious about how 40 servants made a 48-room mansion appear to run effortlessly. 3 weeks. That's how close it came to destruction. 3 weeks separated the Elms from becoming a shopping center. Its limestone blocks hauled away, its history erased, its lessons lost. But timing, determination, and a stock market downturn converged at exactly the right moment. The house survived. The story survived. And America retained its most complete example of what Gilded Age life actually looked like, both upstairs and down.